Hi, everybody. This is Marlene with Eerie News, and today is March 6, 2024, Tuesday, March 6, 2024. And like always, we're going to start off with Stranger Than Fiction stories. And this first one is titled A Devil Named Lemuel. Lemuel. Depends on how you pronounce this. Lemuel Smith was born into the least likely of bedeviled households on July 23rd, 1941. He was part of a strictly religious black family living in Amsterdam, New York. His father was a minister, and both of his parents lived in the household. There was no known reasons why Lemuel would have such a compulsion to kill, which according to him started as early as when he was 12 years old, when he nearly smothered a 9-year-old girl to death. The Smith household tasted grief prior to Lemuel's birth, when their son John Jr. died of encephalitis in 1939. Lemuel was the youngest of 4 children born to the couple. By the time Lemuel was 10 years old, he had already suffered at least 3 head injuries. And during those years of his adolescence, he stalked, kissed, touched, and manually penetrated girls. When he was 12 years old, he refused to attend church with his family. As an adult, he was given an EEG, which showed that there was no lasting brain damage from his childhood injuries. On January 21st, 1958, Dorothy Water Street was robbed and beaten to death as she crossed a supermarket parking lot near Lemuel Smith's neighborhood in Amsterdam. Dorothy, 46, mother of 5, was the wife of an undertaker and was walking home from church. Her body was discovered about 11:30 at night by Reverend Durwood L. Smith, pastor of the First Baptist Church, whose home adjoined the Acme parking lot at the east side. Montgomery County Coroner Fred F. Pipito was called and pronounced the woman dead. He said Mrs. Water Street died instantly due to the brutality of her injuries. Her head and face were battered almost beyond recognition, and identification was difficult even for her husband. Evidence pointed towards the 16-year-old Smith, and within 2 days he was brought in for questioning. But the case fell apart when Lemuel would agree to questioning only if he received immunity, which was not agreed to. Only a month before, he was indicted for the burglary of Streck's coffee shop and Ritual's confectionery store in the same neighborhood. He was free after posting a $1,000 bond. During the following summer, he moved to Schenectady with his sister Edith, then to Baltimore with other relatives. In August, he took a 25-year-old woman prisoner in a robbery attempt. He beat Edna Johnson with a 15-inch pipe after tying her hands and feet with a rope and belt. She was unconscious for 13 days. This time, a witness interrupted the crime and the woman was saved. Lemuel was very recognizable since he already measured 6 feet 4 inches in height, though being only 17 years old. In early 1959, he went to trial for the crime and received the maximum sentence, which was 20 years. He served his sentence at Baltimore Penitentiary, where he spent much of his time in solitary confinement. He was denied parole twice, and it was during this time that he converted to Catholicism over the stringent opposition of his family, and he was made the chaplain's assistant. 2 years after becoming the chaplain's assistant, and 10 years into his sentence, he was granted parole based on the chaplain's plea to the parole board. He moved back to the Capital District. It did not take long for Lemuel Smith to stalk other victims to stalk other victims. In May 1969, he kidnapped and sexually assaulted a woman who managed to escape. Later that same day, he kidnapped and raped a 46-year-old friend of his mother's. She convinced him to let her go. After the arrest for this crime, he was sentenced to 4 to 15 years to be served in Attica prison. He was denied parole twice during these years. In October 1976, a law passed by the New York legislature gave Lemuel Smith his freedom, which he took full and immediate advantage of. He had only served 4 years of his sentence. John F. Hatterman and Sons Church Goods Store was situated on Columbia Street in a rundown section of Albany. The store provided articles needed for church services for several decades. On Thanksgiving Eve, 1976, Robert Hatterman, 50, the father of 5, had his throat slit. Margaret Byron, 56, a clerk who had worked there for 10 years, was stabbed 15 times, including twice in the heart. Hederman's elderly father Robert was asleep in a back room of the store when the crime was committed, and he discovered the bodies. Human feces was found on evidence nearby, which later proved valuable, as well as a trail of blood droplets that left the store. Lemuel Smith was free and employed nearby, and hair and blood evidence made him a main suspect. On December 23rd, while Albany police were investigating the double murder, Joan Richburg, 24, was found in her car at Colony Center Mall in Colony. She was taken to a deserted area of the parking lot, where after being raped, her throat was slit and her body was savagely mutilated. The pattern of brutality and more hair evidence made Smith the prime suspect in that murder as well, but he remained free pending investigation. Barely 2 weeks later, on January 10, 1977, a large black man tried to lure a 22-year-old woman named Denise out of a gift shop in Albany. When she resisted, he took her 60-year-old grandmother, Beulah Southwell, hostage and threatened to kill her. When help arrived, he threw the woman down, knocking her unconscious, and deliberately stepped on her hand, breaking it. Only years later would the grandmother see a picture of Smith in the newspaper and identify him as her attacker. On July 22, 1977, Mary Lee Wilson, 30, a legal secretary, was found naked under some brush close to railroad tracks. She had been strangled and mutilated. The horrendous post-mortem mutilation was worse than some veteran investigators had ever seen in the region. Wilson's autopsy revealed she died from asphyxiation caused by a crushed chest. This was because after attacking her, he stomped the young woman to death. He said he flung her body into trees and rammed sticks into her mouth, as well as other parts of her body, causing massive internal injuries. He burned her with cigarettes and bit her on the nose and face. Smith also bit the victim's nipples. During an interview with investigators, he later told police that Miss Wilson was evil and that she was laughing at him, but the bites on Miss Wilson's body left definitive impressions which were of evidentiary value. Initially, the ME could not determine if she had been raped because of massive internal bleeding. Smith was known to frequent the area, and witnesses recalled Wilson being accosted by a large black man. Schenectady police made Smith the prime suspect in her murder. On August 18th, Mary Ann Maggio, 18, who worked in the same area as Mary Lee Wilson, was kidnapped and raped by Lemuel Smith. When he forced her to drive towards Albany afterwards, police stopped the car and arrested Smith without incident. Wilson's remains were exhumed in order to match the bite marks on her neck, breast, and nose to Lemuel's dental plate. They were a match. Around the same time, in late October 1977, Smith was transported to Bleecker Stadium in Albany. He and 4 other men were randomly placed behind 5 screens at one end of the stadium. At the other end of the stadium, a police dog was given the scent of the feces-stained clothing from the Hederman store murders 11 months prior. The dog crossed the entire stadium directly to Lemuel Smith. Out of sight of the dog, the 5 men were randomly rearranged, and the experiment was repeated with the same result. It was successful a third time as well. In May 1978, with the pressure from the dog experiment and the bite mark match, Smith confessed to 5 murders, including the murder of Dorothy Waterstreet nearly 20 years earlier. Along with his confessions, Smith revealed disturbing secrets about lifelong mental problems, including a claim that he suffered from multiple personality disorder. He attested to being controlled by the spirit of his deceased brother, John Jr., who had died before he was born. Smith was examined by Dr. Zeev Kloppot, a court-appointed psychiatrist who found that Smith believed John, his dead brother, was a messenger from the devil, and whenever Smith committed a rape or murder, he thought John would protect him from punishment. Smith's rage seemed to be generated from Smith's upbringing and a strong resentment to his mother. A prosecution psychiatrist later testified that Smith was a manipulator and played the court system well. He said Smith fabricated mental illness because he knew he would get a lighter sentence. When it was decided to go ahead with the initial rape and kidnapping trials, 2 doctors testified to his delusions, but stopped short of saying he was criminally insane. Smith was found guilty of rape in Saratoga County and on March 1978 was sentenced to 10 to 20 years in prison. 4 months later, a 4-day bench trial in Schenectady ended with Smith found guilty of kidnapping, and he was sentenced to another 25 years to life. Soon after, Lemuel Smith unsuccessfully attempted suicide. In Albany, Smith was indicted for the Hederman store double murder. He was found guilty on February 1979 and sentenced to another 50 years to life. When the bite mark evidence was presented in the Marilee Wilson murder case, Smith was indicted for her murder. He was also indicted for the murder of Joan Richburg after confessing. Since there was already no chance of him ever leaving prison, the indictments were dismissed. In 1981, Lemuel Smith was serving a sentence at Green Haven Correctional Facility. Donna Payant, a corrections officer at the facility, was married and had 3 children. In May of that year, Payant was on duty when she received a phone call, and she told her co-worker she needed to take care of a problem. When she missed roll call, hundreds of corrections officers combed the entire prison grounds throughout the night and into the following morning. Smith had strangled Donna Payant in the chaplain's office, stuffed her body into a garbage bag, and took it to one of the dumpsters. Trash dumpsters were emptied into a truck, which police escorted to a dump site 20 miles away. When the garbage was spread out, officers finally found Payant's mutilated body. It was the first time in the United States that a female corrections officer had ever been killed inside a prison. More than 5,000 officers attended Payant's funeral, and New York Governor Hugh Carey officially vowed a swift response. The same examiner that observed bite marks on Marilee Wilson was coincidentally called to examine bite marks on Payant's body. He quickly recognized the bite marks, and Lemuel Smith was charged with Payant's murder in June 1981. The charge carried a mandatory death sentence. The high-profile nature of Donna Payant's murder brought high-profile lawyers William Kunstler and C. Vernon Mason. Mason was later a main player in the alleged Tawana Broxley hoax. The team alleged everything from promiscuity by Payant to guards dealing drugs inside and outside the prison. They were unable to evade the bite marks evidence, however, and even their own expert witness agreed that the bite marks on Payant matched those on Marilee Wilson. The capital murder trial began on January 20, 1983, more than 18 months after Smith's arrest. The defense questioned testimony of inmates and other corrections officers and proposed conspiracy theories. But with no answer to the bite mark evidence, Smith was found guilty 3 months later at the conclusion of the trial. Considered the only deterrent for prisoners already serving life sentences, a New York law at the time mandated that Smith automatically be sentenced to death. He was sentenced in June. On July 12, 1984, an appeal by Smith called the law's constitutionality into question and was successful in commuting his death sentence to another term of life. Throughout the years that Lemuel Smith was in prison, he was examined by several doctors and found not to have been physically, mentally, or sexually abused by his parents. He was heterosexual, but participated in homosexual relations while he was in prison. He abused drugs and alcohol and was diagnosed with schizophrenia and borderline personality disorder. Serial killer Lemuel Smith is incarcerated at 5 Points Correctional Facility in Seneca County. As of 2024, he is 82 years old and wheelchair bound. And see this gentleman right here is one that you should never have set free from the beginning. How many lives could have been spared if he had been kept to serve his full sentences? Okay, next story out of Stranger Than Fiction is called Exorcist Murder Still Unsolved. In 1998, a priest was brutally murdered in a little rural town in Wisconsin. His throat was slit, and despite the advances in DNA identification and the public's mistaken belief in the CSI effect, the crime remains unsolved till this day. By the way, the CSI effect is something where people look at the show and they think that when they come and they do all these tests that the results are immediate and that's it. In conclusion, they get the killer. That's not real life. Anyway, Reverend Alfred Kuntz had just finished co-hosting a faith-based radio show named Our Catholic Family on WEKZ in Monroe, Wisconsin on the evening of March 3rd, 1998. He had been dropped off at St. Michael Church by Father Charles Fior, and he spoke on the phone at 10:23 p.m. Later was verified by investigators the call was to another priest to discuss church business. Later that night or during the early morning of March 4th, someone attacked Father Kuntz. The doors were locked and there was no evidence of forced entry, leading to the belief that either Father Kuntz let the person in or the perpetrator had found a way in that was not necessarily through the door. Early the next morning, he was found by one of the teachers, Brian Jackson, lying in a pool of blood in the parish's tiny school near his living quarters, which consisted of a desk and a cot in a small classroom. His injuries indicated he had been in a terrible fight, and it appeared he was dragged while he was insensible to the foot of a statue of St. Michael the Archangel, where his carotid artery was sliced with an edged weapon. He was left to bleed out face down. Father Kuntz was buried next to his brother and father in Fenmore, Wisconsin. An autopsy determined he had died from loss of blood. Kuntz, who was 67 years old, was a priest from St. Michael Catholic Church in the village of Dane. He was known for his strict adherence to conservative, traditional Catholic teachings. He said Mass in Latin, and as a judicial vicar for the Madison Diocese and a member of the marriage tribunal, made it difficult for persons to receive annulments after divorce. He expressed disdain for homosexuals, especially cases of pederasty, in rectories and chanceries. No doubt he foresaw the slew of sexual abuse allegations that would swamp the church a few scant years later. Was the motive robbery, something personal, or perhaps something much darker? But who would wish to brutally slay a kindly 67-year-old priest who had served the parish for 30 years and who didn't even collect a salary at the small parish that only had a population of 600? Later, some would say Kuntz planned to expose sexually deviant priests by reading their names on the radio program. His death was 4 years before the Boston Globe published their story concerning abuse by American clergy. Whether this was true or not, he never did speak about this. The one-time Golden Glove boxer turned priest said Mass every day, ran St. Michael's School, and oversaw the finances both the church and the school. He mentored teachers, counseled his parishioners, and participated fully in all parish activities. He also mowed the cemetery lawn. Father Kuntz was outspoken about corruption and sexual abuse within the Catholic Church, filing reports about incidents occurring within the diocese. In 1996, Father Kuntz became a canon law advisor to the Illinois-based Roman Catholic Faithful, or RCF, who was headed by lay Catholic activist Stephen Brady. RCF was investigating the misdeeds of Bishop Daniel Ryan. Ryan was accused of trolling area parks for male prostitutes, preferring underage ones, and for assaulting a mentally disabled man. Ryan abruptly retired in October 1999, shortly before a lawsuit was filed accusing him of covering up the sexual abuse of a child by another Illinois priest. He died in December 2015 at the age of 85. After Kuntz was murdered, Brady bought a bulletproof vest. Did he suspect he might be targeted as well? Besides being an expert in canon law, he had connections to influential people, and most of all, he was also a believer in the occult. In other words, he believed that the devil was real, and he ministered to those troubled by demons as an exorcist. And then, of course, there was the radio show he hosted. Kuntz told his congregation of an encounter with a young lady who came to the chancery. She had been referred to him, and perhaps suspecting the reason why, he asked her to take a chair beneath a crucifix. Within a few minutes, a throaty, animal-like growl came from her, and then she said, "Where is he?" The chancery staff took off, and nobody returned until she exited. It turned out the lady had participated in satanic rituals and was trying to free herself from demonic influences. Eventually, he was able to assist her, and she went on to lead a normal life somewhere in the Midwest. No doubt he stepped on several church toes throughout the years, calling out corruption among church members as being influenced by evil and hiding behind their priestly robes. He was also a friend of another exorcist named Malachi Martin, who he consulted with about exorcisms. Dr. Martin believed that Luciferians were active within the ranks of the church, even penetrating the College of Cardinals. In a national radio program transmitted in May 1998, Malachi Martin said he was found at 7 o'clock in the morning with his throat cut from ear to ear in his own blood, face down into it, and with various acts of desecration of his body, which are normally associated with Satanist-inflicted death. This is Malachi Martin talking about the way Father Kuntz was murdered. He believed Kuntz was picked off by someone wanting to silence him. Was the reason for Father Kuntz's murder convoluted and tied to occultists and the Catholic Church, or something as mundane as a robbery? In March 1998, Dane County detectives visited RCF headquarters and interviewed Stephen Brady. He said Father Kuntz was deeply involved in the Ryan investigation. The detectives also interviewed Frank Bergen, an inmate at Jacksonville Correctional Center, who was a one-time male prostitute and habitual criminal. He claimed Bishop Ryan paid him for sex many times during the 1980s and 1990s. These encounters had started when he was 16 years old. He said Ryan would pick up other male prostitutes from the streets and take them back to the rectory for sex. Malachi Martin, once a Jesuit, had received authority from the Vatican to conduct exorcism in the tri-state area in the northeast United States. He said Father Kuntz's exorcism were done in a very low-profile method, since many times it involved confessional material. Martin said that other prominent priests in the area got telephone calls threatening they could end up the same way as Father Kuntz. He said that in the weeks before his death, Kuntz had expressed fear for his safety. Father Charles Fior occasionally spoke of, quote, secret missions he made with Kuntz to Chicago as it combated Satanism and pederasty among the priests. According to the Okie traditionalists, they, quote, did secret official missions in the archdiocese. Their goal was to put a dent in the underground satanic, pedophilic clerical cabal that operated there. What he related made the hairs on the back of my arm stand on end. Literally, I would learn later this became widely, publicly known, which is why I can share it. End quote. During their investigations of Bishop Ryan, RCF came across information of the Boys Club, which was a network of pedophile homosexual priests and laity in Chicago. They were suspected not only of pederasty, but murder and practicing Satanism. Father Andrew Greeley mentioned the group in his book, Furthermore, Memories of a Parish Priest. In it, Greeley wrote, they are, quote, they are a dangerous group. There is reason to believe they are responsible for one murder and may perhaps have been involved in the murder of the murderer, end quote. Greeley never identified any of the members of the Boys Club, but he was referring to the unsolved 1984 murder of Dr. Francis E. Pellegrini. The 47-year-old professor taught a city college of Chicago and was found with 20 stab wounds in his South Side apartment. Like Father Kuntz, there was no sign of forced entry into his home. Pellegrini's mother, who lived with him, was away on a trip to New York. He was the organist and choir director at All Saints St. Anthony of Padua Catholic Church. One theory was that he was about to expose the Boys Club. Thomas R. Hampson, founder of Truth Alliance Foundation, and a private detective said a peripheral member of the Boys Club met with Father Kuntz in Wisconsin in the years before the murder. He investigated the club and abuse perpetrated by them against teenage boys. He described the boys as a loosely organized group of priests and laity who cultivated sexual relationship with vulnerable boys and shared these boys with each other. They were centered out of the Chicago Bridgeport neighborhood. In 2004, Sheila Parkhill, a Texas attorney, was investigating the Boys Club. She believed they were involved in ritualistic and satanic abuse of children, as well as murder, credit card theft, and fraud. One member was convicted of predatory sexual abuse of a child. However, most have never been charged with a crime. Others escaped justice by simply dying. She challenged Father Greeley to reveal the information he claimed to have in safekeeping about the ring of predators that may have been involved in the murder of Greeley's then acquaintance Francis E. Pellegrini. The following are portions of the email Sheila Parkhill sent Father Greeley, dated May of 2004. Quote, Dear Father Greeley, I have followed your career and writings for many years now, reading the many stories you've written about the sexual abuse crisis in our church, the problems, the solutions, stories you have written denouncing the bishops and their cover-ups. Are the bishops sorry at all? You asked in August 3rd of 2003. They all sound so right, so self-righteous, and yet, when it comes to your personal life, doing the right thing yourself, your silence is deafening. I had to laugh when I read that Bishop Wilton Gregory said, I can assure you known offenders are not in the ministry. Yet you and I both know that is not true. We both know of at least 6. While I do not yet have the proof in my hands, you do. For over a year now, I've been investigating the Boys Club in Chicago. In light of the arrest of Father Gerard Robinson of Toledo, isn't it time you do something about the Chicago Boys Club, including the priest, now bishop, whose name has been included with it? They're still in the ministry, active in parishes. Some of those parishes have schools. They have not yet been exposed. You have made it clear to all that you know who they are. Knowingly allowing evil conduct to evade justice is to cooperate with evil. In your autobiographical books, Confessions of a Parish Priest, and furthermore, memories of a parish priest, you clearly acknowledge that you know who they are. Excuse me. I know that some of the information you obtained came from connections with the Chicago Police Department, and some from the priest who wrote the letter to the late Joseph Cardinal Bernardin about the group and their activities. I know that you work closely with that priest and that he gave you some of that information because he lived with one of them and found out what was going on. I believe you have a copy of that letter, which contains the names of the perpetrators, among other things, in safekeeping. I know that you knew at least one of those murder victims, Frank Pellegrini, from the university. I know the police talked with you during the investigation. One of them told me you wouldn't give them any information. I know that you know that Pellegrini wrote a letter to Vicar of Priest Tom Ventura revealing the sexual conduct and his plan to go to the authorities with the information. But before he could do that, he was found murdered, a satanic murder. It has been reported that Father Ventura left the priesthood in 2002. End quote. Later, Stephen Brady described the connection between events thus, quote, on February 11, 1997, RCF held its first press conference accusing Bishop Ryan of sexual misconduct. Since that time, the main priest accuser against Ryan has been told by a Vatican priest to fear for his life and stay away from RCF. Father Alfred Kuntz, a holy and Orthodox priest working with RCF, was brutally murdered. And we are beginning to uncover what I believe to be a good old boys club of sexual perverts within the American hierarchy, who scandalize the faithful, sodomize the innocent, and who are banding together out of need and greed. Satan seems to rule in their world. End quote. During the initial investigation, police suspected Brian Jackson, but there was no physical evidence against him. Later, Jackson would claim that by police focusing on him, they overlooked other leads. Weeks became months and no arrests were made. Residents of Dane, Malachi Martin, and others familiar with law enforcement procedures wondered why there were no viable suspects. In July 1999, Malachi Martin died when he hit his head after falling in his Manhattan apartment. He told a friend that even though he was alone, he felt he had been pushed from the stool on which he stood. This came out in a 2017 documentary titled Hostage to the Devil, the same as Martin's 1987 book. Malachi Martin had participated in an exorcism of a 4-year-old girl only a few days before the accident. In 2002, corruption was uncovered in the Chicago diocese, giving truth to Father Kuntz's allegation. In May 2023, the Illinois Attorney General issued a report that 4 priests with substantiated child sexual abuse allegations against them served in Catholic churches in Edwardsville between 1954 and 1980. Sexual abuse of children was reported to have occurred in Edwardsville and Maryville by 3 of the 5 priests. Another priest served in Maryville from 1982 to 1984. The report named the following priests: George Fowler, St. Boniface Catholic Church, from 1954 to 1961. Robert Dudd, SIUE Newman Catholic Church, 1968. Garrett Neil D., St. Boniface, 1973 to 1976. Walter Wirtz, St. Thomas, Edwardsville, 1964 to 1968. And St. Boniface, 1979 to 1980. Alvin Campbell, Mother of Perpetual Help in Maryville, 1982 to 1984. The AG announced that after a 4.5-year investigation which produced a 700-page report, it was found that 1,997 children were abused between 1950 and 2019 by 451 Catholic clergy in Illinois. In the Diocese of Springfield alone, 32 clergy members were identified as having sexually abused children. One of these priests was Walter Wirtz. As of 2023, there are 22 survivors. He abused children from 1964 into the 1980s. The Springfield Diocese claimed it received the first report against Father Wirtz in 1985. The AG in their report contests this date, claiming that Bishop O'Connor received reports of Wirtz's inappropriate conduct with children as far back as 1962. Ironically, Father Frank Westhoff, who himself was a substantiated child sex abuser, told O'Connor that, quote, Weirds was engaging in inappropriate activity with young boys, end quote. According to Westhoff, when he spoke of the complaints of different families against Weirds, the bishop replied that Father Westhoff was just engaging in self-aggrandizement at the expense of the reputation of another priest. The bishop simply refused to accept the list of names Father Westhoff had prepared and told him to take it home. From 1961 to 1978, Weirds was assigned to 8 different parishes by Bishop O'Connor. By the time he was criminally charged in 1985, Weirds had sexually abused approximately 20 young boys. In 1986, Weirds pled guilty to sexually abusing children and was sentenced to 6 years in prison. He served only 3 years of his sentence at a minimum security facility. In 1998, he was fired from Palm Beach Community College in Florida after it was learned he had lied on his job application about being a convicted child molester. By then, he had been laicized from the church. The reports on the other priests follow the same pattern of denial by the hierarchy in the diocese, ignoring reports of abuse of children at the hand of these individuals, thus allowing them to victimize others by transferring them to another parish. In the intervening years after Father Kunz's murder, there have been no deathbed or jail cell confessions from either a perpetrator or a witness, and one has to wonder if any that could have shed light on what happened that winter night in 1998 took their secret to the grave. But do you really think Father Kuntz was killed due to robbery when it was known this was a poor parish and there was nothing of value to take? Or does the motive exist down a very dark rabbit hole? And I have a link to Father Kuntz's homicide report. If anybody cares to read it, there's a PDF. If you come to Stranger Than Fiction Stories, if anybody wants to read that. And again, I don't think that this was robbery because, again, it was a poor parish. It was not known to have valuables. And why kill a priest that way? You knock him unconscious and you bleed him out in front of a statue of St. Michael the Archangel. That doesn't jive as far as I'm concerned with the it was a robbery kind of thing, and also that no forced entry. Very dark things in that story. Okay, we are now moving on to Atlas Obscura, and this is titled The Mystery of Monsieur de New York, Celebrity Hangman. All right, in 1881, a mysterious story ran in the National Police Gazette, a salacious saloon and barbershop tabloid that peddled stories about a New York City increasingly riddled with crime, street gangs, and poverty. It described an unremarkable man who rides the train downtown from Harlem every morning at 9 a.m. Very few of any of the many passengers know that the quiet, ruddy-faced, stout gentleman with cheerful looks who enters the train at 125th Street is George Monsieur de New York. The column read. The name would have struck a unique note of fear and respect across the city. Monsieur de New York was the resident executioner, and his true identity was a secret. You could be sitting next to him on the train, the Gazette suggested, and never know it. Nearly 30 years earlier, a New York sheriff had been nursing a scotch at his favorite City Hall watering hole when a pleasant-faced young man approached. The city's hangman had recently resigned after his identity became so well known that he'd been both hissed and cheered on the street. Sheriff, I hear you're looking for a chap to do that little job for you next Friday, the stranger said. Public executions have been outlawed in New York for more than a decade, but the state still sentences criminals to death at a steady clip. The man, then in his early 30s, was a butcher at the nearby market, the National Police Gazette reported, and before that he'd been a sailor with a knack for knots. In slaughterhouses, he'd seen the ideal way to hoist cattle and proposed applying the same technique to humans. Hanging, he told the sheriff, was a science, and he was determined to perfect it. The sheriff was impressed. Before long, there were 2 pirates on the new hangman's dock, Nicholas Howlett and William Saul, infamous gang members who'd stolen a boat and killed a watchman. Monsieur de New York, as he would later be known, had designed an all-new gallows with a 20-foot high beam and a pulley system. Before the big reveal, he had tested, observed, and adjusted his setup like the manager of a new theater just prior to the first performance, according to the Gazette. On hanging day, he was the master of ceremonies, as he was for all of the many executions he would perform, according to observers. He would ascend the gallows in a black suit carrying a staff. He pulled a cap over the head of the condemned, and then placed the rope around his neck, with a knot under the chin rather than at the ear, in a technique he took from London. After a consoling whisper, "You needn't fear, or be a man, my boy," he signaled to a man stationed in a closet on the other end of the pulley system to release a set of weights. The criminal would then be hoisted into the air. Under this new overseer, a public execution is not so terrible a thing to witness as many might suppose, one reporter wrote after watching the hanging of an axe murderer. The newspapers gave him the name Monsieur de New York and also referred to him as George. For decades, his true identity was fodder for columnists and crime documentarians of New York. It may never truly be known, but the clues he left behind paint an eerie composite of an engineer and an artist, a showman and a specter. He traversed New York society as a quintessential resident and haunted its dark underbelly as its executioner. Public executions had been common in New York until 1835, when a period of social reform presented ideas about rehabilitation that centered, unironically, around practices such as solitary confinement, meant to provide contemplative time for prisoners. By that time, public executions had become rowdy, drunken events, says Wilbur Miller, a Stony Brook University historian who studies crime and policing. The last word of the condemned, which had once been considered warnings for the public, were more often being used as justifications for their deeds. Pamphlets describing the lives of the criminals were widely distributed. An unprofessional hangman made the spectacle as grisly as the crimes themselves. Predictably, people showed up. It was meant to be a grave moral lesson for the crowd, Miller says, but it became a sport. The New York Police Department was officially created in 1845, with officers patrolling the neighborhood where they lived without uniforms. Interesting. In the growing city, a blossoming immigrant population had ignited fear among middle-class New Yorkers. Saloons, brothels, and street gangs seemed to be on the rise. The police force was created as a direct response to the increasing sense of disorderliness and disarray, says Miller. The existing sheriff's department grew, too, tasked with supervising the jails, issuing evictions, and carrying out executions. They earned money from the fees they charged the city for those services. In the case of executions, it could be thousands of dollars a head. Chaotic New York City was professionalizing and standardizing law and order. By this time, a peculiar building in Lower Manhattan became the hub for this energy. The Halls of Justice and House of Detention, or the Tombs, as it was known, was a squat structure with a column granite edifice that was built to resemble an ancient Egyptian mausoleum. Around 50,000 prisoners passed through its grand doors between 1838 to 1902, and those sentenced to death there would have to cross the Bridge of Sighs, which connected the prison with the gallows, over a courtyard. Today, the Manhattan Detention Complex, built in 1983, carries the nickname The Tombs, the fourth downtown building to do so. Though executions in the Tombs were not public affairs, audiences at a hanging could still number in the hundreds. Clergy, family, and dozens of journalists and members of law enforcement. In some cases, 10 times more tickets were given out than the 200-person capacity yard could accommodate. Those who couldn't make it crowded the streets and filled the windows of houses overlooking the gallows. It was still a type of public spectacle. Newspapers ran double-page spreads that spared no detail. The dropping pulse of the hangman, the color of their fingertips, the sounds of the scene. It was into this world that Monsieur de New York stepped, plied his trade, and quickly built notoriety that spread beyond the city. After the hanging of a murderer named Jack Reynolds in 1870, conducted by Monsieur de New York, a reporter for the Brooklyn Daily Eagle wrote, "The fact that a fellow creature is going to be executed seems to have an unexplainable fascination for the lower orders of humanity." It looked as if the worst portions of New York had put on exhibition their choicest specimens of deteriorated manhood and womanhood. Public executions were still legal under federal law, and Monsieur de New York took part in that spectacle as well. He got his first taste of the unquenchable enthusiasm for them on June 13, 1860, when a man named Elias Hicks was put to death for killing a ship captain and two crew members. The federal charge was piracy, and his hanging was to be held at Bedloe's Island, with which a few decades later would become home to the Statue of Liberty. A crowd of 12,000 showed up to watch in steamboats, barges, oyster sloops, yachts, and rowboats. On board, men drank beer and women shaded themselves with parasols. They traveled from Connecticut and Long Island. Hundreds who had never seen a person hung, and multitudes of others who would have shrunk from such a spectacle where an ordinary criminal was to suffer, clamored for permits to look upon the last dying struggles of the man whose extraordinary career of crime had destroyed every sentiment of pity in their breasts, the New York Times reported. Hang me quick, make haste, were Hicks's only words at the gallows. The hangman complied. Few men have passed from earth so wholly unregretted as did this murderer and pirate, the Times reporter wrote. As Monsieur de New York's renown grew, reporters referred to him with a fawning familiarity, even though they knew nothing about the man in the dark suit. An article in the Brooklyn Daily Eagle in 1865 called him an artist in his profession. He hates to see a man die in a mean-spirited manner and never tires of lauding those who show a brave or reckless spirit to the last. His gallows hosted Nat Gordon, a trader caught off the coast of Cuba with a cargo of 800 enslaved Congolese people, a Confederate army captain who had attacked ships and rail lines, a West Point graduate who'd hoped to burn New York down by setting fires in a series of hotels, and P.T. Barnum's museum. The hangings often took place on Friday, thus the week would open free from the painful scene, a newspaper reported. The condemned were given last meals, edited their confessions, and wrote letters. One sent off locks of hair to his friends, another had a photograph taken of himself. He has hung more men than any other official on the continent, and can make the boast that none of his jobs ever fail, a column in the Democrat and Chronicle in Rochester reported in 1880. Detroit Times noted his preference for Italian hemp rope, and relayed that he never used the same piece twice. One stretch takes the life out of it, he told the reporter. Soon Monsieur de New York's name was making news as far away as Iowa and Missouri. He fielded requests from sheriffs across America to erect their gallows and conduct their executions. Once, while he was traveling on the train back from an execution in upstate New York, a group crowded around him. Improvising a gallows on the spot, he showed off his technique and placed a noose, recently used around the neck of a reporter. It quickly silenced the car. Monsieur de New York even held political sway. In 1872, he threw his weight behind Ulysses Grant's run for a second term. The celebrated hangman and the execution of scores of criminals, the Brooklyn Daily Eagle reported, was a vehement Grantite. But still, his identity remained a mystery. For 6 generations, the Samson family of Paris had held the title of official executioners of France. Dressed in blood-red coats, they killed thousands. Under special patronage of the government, the members of the race were known as Monsieur de Paris, in contradistinction to such mere provincial artists that labored on the less distinguished scaffolds of Bordeaux or Orleans. One newspaper noted, the so-called gentleman of Paris was both respected and reviled. Once, as a young boy, a future Monsieur de Paris had to leave his private school when his father's profession was discovered. One Samson executed Louis XVI, another Marie Antoinette. The 159-year reign of the first family of execution ended in 1847. It was just 6 years later that a young hangman in New York adopted a variation of the moniker. Some articles reported that he'd asked to keep his name out of the public record as a condition of his employment. In 1880, an 1880 article notes that he was determined that it should never be thrown in his face. However, newspapers often referred to him by a name, George W. Isaacs. Many columnists believe this was a pseudonym, but not all. It is said that the name is assumed in order to protect the family from notoriety, but I do not believe the statement, wrote a journalist who interviewed Monsieur de New York himself. Once, after a Brooklyn Daily Eagle report of hanging in which the name George W. Isaacs was used, a man of the same name called the paper to deny the report, though perhaps not entirely convincingly. He had occasionally been a superintendent of execution, he said, but did not want his children or other people reading the Eagle to suppose that he was ever a hangman. A hangman was regarded with a kind of dread, says Wilbur Miller, the historian, They were not really able to mingle in society. A good hangman might be respected in a certain way, but very distantly. They were marginal figures. They represented a dark side of society. Though both names, Monsieur de New York and George W. Isaacs, appeared in dozens of newspaper articles, his biography maintained a hazy mythical quality. He was large and heavily built, in some accounts short and neatly dressed in others. One described him as one of the most famous pistol shots in his day. In others he was a butcher's assistant, a clerk at the Fulton market, or simply a quiet deputy sheriff. He may be seen almost any day at the sheriff's office, where he is always ready to converse on his dreadful art, wrote one journalist, who was described as an estimable man, a good neighbor, and a true friend, who attended an uptown Methodist church. He made anywhere between $75 to $250 per execution. Perhaps all these things were true at once. An 1850 census shows that George W. Isaacs operated a butcher stand in the 1850s, and another lists him as a clerk at the Fulton Market. In the 1870 census finds a George W. Isaacs living in the 12th Ward of New York, which covers eastern Harlem, retired at age 59, with his wife and 7 others, ages 7 to 28, living with him. Monsieur de New York's enthusiasm for the job was so great that he once wrote to the White House to volunteer to pay his own way to Nebraska to carry out the execution of 30 Native Americans, just so he could test a new gallows he designed and patented that could hang dozens of people at once. Their sentences were commuted, much to the chagrin of the inventor, an article reported. One newspaper stated that he carried out 18 executions over a 30-year career and called him the most successful of his profession in existence. Another counted 38 executions over the same period, and by the 1880s neither name appeared in the papers much at all. The exploits of Monsieur de New York, George W. Isaacs, were already entering the realm of legend. In 1884, a Brooklyn Daily Eagle column called it a popular fallacy that George W. Isaacs had existed at all. The fact is that there never was a man by the name of Isaacs who performed the unpleasant duty, the article reported, claiming that one Joe Atkinson, a carpenter credited with helping design Isaac's signature gallows, was the true hangman, and the real Isaacs, a man of kindly disposition and generous of heart, was merely a deputy sheriff. While he just rigged the ropes once or twice, this was all that ever he had to do with the distasteful duties of a hangman. When Atkinson was profiled in the New York World in 1888, under the headline, "It is nice to be hanged, pretty women will bring you flowers and pet you," his claims to the title of hangman didn't sit right with readers. One wrote to complain. Atkinson was a mere carpenter, the reader said, while Isaacs was a sailor who knew how to rig pulleys and tie ropes. By then, however, Isaacs had died. If Joe Atkinson had any conscience, he will make the amends honorable and no longer walk in borrowed plumes as a veteran hangman of New York. Yet Atkinson continued to claim the title of New York's hangman, while also occasionally denying that Joe Atkinson was even his name. In an 1890 interview, Atkinson claimed to have executed 62 people, all documented in a scrapbook he kept. "He is more repulsive than the gallows or its freight of lifeless flesh," wrote a reporter for the Buffalo Courier Express. After a hanging, he'd work the crowd to compliment his own work. "Wasn't that a fine job?" he'd say. "Slick, I tell you. Neck broken at once. Heard it crack myself the moment the rope went off. Electricity could do no better." Atkinson hardly sounded like the genteel figure the moniker was associated with, but whatever his role in the story of Monsieur de New York, Atkinson would see the last days of legal hangings. In 1887, before Isaacs had reportedly died, a man claiming the title of Monsieur de New York had emerged from his relative's silence to tell a reporter from Rochester's Democrat and Chronicle that he believed the newfangled technology for execution, the electric chair, had no chance of superseding his beloved gallows. 2 years later, a New York man named William Kemmler killed his wife with a hatchet, and early in 1890 was sentenced to death by electricity. A lawsuit followed and the Supreme Court deemed the method constitutional. The operator of the latest state-sanctioned death machine was Edwin F. Davis, an electrician credited with building the first electric chair. in 1890. New York was the first state to adopt the technology. In 1893, an article ran in the New York World that cast the old gallows in a nostalgic light. It described a once busy contraption that now sat amongst trash in a room under the downtown Manhattan post office. This gallows has a history, the writer opined. On it were put to death before and during the Civil War murderers, pirates, slavers, guerrillas, and spies. It had been built by George W. Isaacs, the article stated. Before that, hangings had been held in Washington Square Park, overseen by a hangman who wore a sword and sash. Like so many in New York, even death had surrendered to modernity. The old gallows had been saved by a janitor who stopped visitors from taking pieces as souvenirs after it was decommissioned. The author seemed to hope that the device might have one last hurrah. Decades later, an executioner named Robert Elliott was being dubbed by newspapers as Monsieur de New York, Boston, and Trenton. In 1936, he'd flip on the switch of the electric chair for a fee of $150. He justified his profession on the ground that the people who fire the furnace at the power plant or who have anything else to do with electricity are just as much to blame as he. He only turns the switch, wrote the Chattanooga News. Death penalty was shot down by a U.S. Supreme Court ruling in 1972, but states were allowed to reinstate it a few years later. By then, the star status of an executioner had long vanished, and with it the identity of the gentleman of New York. You know what? In here I was thinking they were going to actually say what his real name was. Very interesting. Very, very interesting. Okay, let's go back to Stranger Than Fiction stories. This one's titled Skeleton in the Chimney. It was Labor Day weekend, and Steve Lithan, owner of the Good and Loud Music in Dane County, Wisconsin, was fixing a water leak after a boiler was removed. When he shone a light into the chimney, the last thing he expected to see was a human skull. This takes place in Dane County, Wisconsin, September 3rd, 1989. A construction crew made a hole at the base of the chimney to remove the remains. They also found a shoe, pieces of clothing, and a 6-inch clump of intact reddish brown hair. Early on, it was determined the skeleton belonged to a man ranging in age from 18 to 30 years. It was estimated he had been there about 2 years or as recently as 2 months. He was Caucasian, 5 feet 5 inches, tall with a small build, brownish hair, and a pronounced overbite. Later on, his probable age was amended to 22 to 27. The building was constructed in the 1960s, and prior to the music store, the pastry cart, a bakery rented the space. Before that, there had been the bread shop, a Christian bookstore. It was believed any smell coming from the decomposing body would have been vented through the chimney, which rose about 6 or 7 feet above the store, or the smells from the bakery would have helped to mask the odor. The building sat vacant from December 1988 to April 1989 until Good and Loud bought the space. However, it remained unoccupied until their grand opening in August 1989. Then the case took a strange twist when it was discovered that the man was dressed like a woman. He was wearing a sleeveless paisley dress with a matching belt, a long-sleeve button-down shirt, a medium-sized White Stag brand shaggy pal sweater, and pointy, low-heeled women's shoes. He was wearing one pair of ankle socks and carried another pair. However, he was not wearing underwear, a bra, or undershirt. Detectives also found a German Iron Cross medallion, a butter knife, and a pocket comb. An anthropologist from UW-Madison confirmed the remains belonged to a man. Authorities suspected the person may have been a cross-dresser or for some reason was disguising himself as a woman. In November 1989, the case was televised nationwide on hard copy. Police had run out of leads, and there were no missing person reports that corresponded with this person. It was around this time that police released other information about the body. The victim's pelvic bone had 2 breaks in it, which was theorized happened before he died. The bones had no other injuries. Police believed he was prostituting himself and was killed by a maddened attacker after it was discovered he was not a woman. To get into the chimney base, the body was stuffed feet first down a pipe measuring 11 3/4 inches. He was either dead or unconscious when shoved in there. That he actually jumped in there and got stuck in a bungled burglary scenario would be the most remote version of how this man ended up in there. Plus, why would anyone break into a bakery since the music shop had not opened yet? In 1990, the results of a reconstruction by the Smithsonian Institution was displayed. By then, the police had not been able to identify him, despite the nationwide exposure given by hard copy. Dental records were checked as well as missing persons files, and no match could be found. Most disturbing was no one came forward to identify who this person was. The closest explanation was that he was a transient and had not been long in the area. Police showed pictures of the reconstruction to dozens of people who worked in the building up to 2 years before the bones were found to see if he was a former employee or an area resident. No one recognized him. Police noted the chimney was not visible from any road running through the area, so the victim or the attacker was familiar with the neighborhood and was not a place where someone would dump a body in a hasty effort to get rid of it. This opening was on the rooftop of the building, and the clay-lined chimney extended downward for 27 feet. Lethan, the owner of Good and Loud, provided detectives at the time of the initial investigation with photos when the building was for sale, which showed old appliances stacked against the back wall, which would have acted as an improvised ladder. The police at best suspected there was some association with the building and the body, theorizing it would have been easier to get rid of the remains in a dumpster than shove it down the narrow aperture. In 2012, George Hesselberg, a writer for the Wisconsin State Journal, received a tip. He had been writing a yearly commentary on the skeleton in the chimney up until 2003. Laura Zimmerman, who had just retired, said that in 1990 she was working in the Senate Sergeant at Arms office when she saw the rendition of the man in the chimney, which appeared in the newspaper. She said she recognized the face as belonging to one of the Capitol pages, and even made a comment to the Sergeant at Arms. He didn't recognize it, but there was from 30 to 40 pages on staff at the time. Hesselberg called police, who in turn listened to Zimmerman's story. They circulated the photos of the reconstructed skull to staff and interns from that time period. No one recognized the man. In 2018, a new detective was given the case, and in conjunction with DNA Dope Project, the rootless hair sample was given over to a laboratory in 2021. The hope, of course, is that they can retrieve a DNA profile which be matched to a living relative. As of 2022, they are still working on it. Since then, the building on University Avenue in Madison has been demolished and turned into a coffee shop. It's an open case, and I have here a contact number for Madison, City of Madison Police Department with any information. Because, honestly, going back that far, I think, again, like other cases and like others that are being solved, at this point, it's going to be a DNA match is about the only way that they might have a chance of IDing this person. Next part of the same story, but a separate case very similar, which is titled Another Skeleton in the Chimney. This is not the first time a chimney became a tomb for a human and left more questions than answers. 5 years before the discovery was made in Madison, Wisconsin, Joseph Wayne Schnecksnyder, I don't know how to pronounce it, Schnecksnyder, 22, was last seen by his family in January of 1984. He was to appear in district court on a charge of possession of a stolen vehicle, but never showed up. When the sheriff came to the family's residence, the mother told deputies he had run off to avoid the court proceedings. Known as a wanderer, Schnecksnyder first ran off when he was 9 or 10 years old. He dropped out of high school in the ninth grade. In 1978, when he was 17 years old, his mother placed an announcement in the local newspaper to report him missing with a description. She ran the ad every week for a whole month. It seemed that her son made a habit of going on walkabout and would return eventually. He served briefly in the Louisiana National Guard and completed training in July 1980 at Fort Leonard Wood in Missouri. It was noted his wife Melinda and his mother, Eula Bro, lived in Abbeville. Eventually, he left with a medical discharge. When he dropped from sight in 1984, he was not reported missing by his family since they thought he would turn up eventually, like he had done other times. His mother was worried, but his brother Robert reminded her of Joe's penchant for disappearing for a time. He once told one of his brothers he had seen every state in the country. He followed carnivals and once traveled with a circus selling cotton candy and peanuts. Friends who grew up with him described him as simple and quiet. Months became years until May 2011, when a strange discovery was made in the local bank's chimney. The vacant second floor of the building was being converted into offices when a construction worker tugged on fabric coming out of the chimney. It dislodged bones and old clothes. The person in the chimney was wearing a yellow long sleeve shirt, a pair of jeans, blue tennis shoes, and jockey shorts with his surname printed on the waistband. There was also gloves, a magazine, a watch, a cigarette lighter, and a wallet with his birth certificate and social security card, which left little doubt about his identity. There was no signs of foul play as far as the bones were concerned, and police explained that without soft tissue, it would be impossible to determine if he had met with foul play. A DNA test confirmed his identity. Schick Snyder had gone into a 14-inch by 14-inch chimney feet first. This opening narrowed towards the end where it opened into a small fireplace on the second floor. If he had gone in there alive, it would have been hard for anyone to hear him, as he was 20 feet above the street, surrounded by brick. No one working on the first floor reported strange noises or smells, and the second floor was used only for storage. Ironically, in 1987, the chimneys in Abbeville's downtown were capped, but no one noticed what was left of Scheck Snyder inside the one belonging to the Bank of Abbeville. His brother had no answers as to why his brother was in the chimney, but admitted that before he disappeared he was hanging out with a bad crowd. There were no burglary tools with the remains. So you ask yourself, a 14 by 14 is a very, very narrow opening. I can't imagine anybody trying to go down one of these and thinking what they're going to come out to. I don't know. I don't know. There's something. It's like you hope. I don't know. Very interesting. Okay, next story is also out of Stranger Than Fiction stories, and it's titled Descent into Madness. It was the day after Christmas, 1929, when newspapers in North Carolina carried the disturbing news of a father who had annihilated his entire family. 60 years would pass before the motive of this heartless act would be learned. His name was Charles Davis Lawson, and within a day of this horrific crime, authorities were trying to understand what caused him to do away with his wife and 6 children. Dr. B.J. Halsebeck, the Stokes County coroner, removed Mr. Lawson's brain and found no injury on it. This was in answer to the question that he had lost his mind after he suffered a blow to the head. This had been intimated by members of the family who said that he had accidentally struck himself in the head with a mattock about 9 months before. The family said that Charles Lawson had been suffering from nervous bouts during the last few months. The only thing they found was evidence of a low-grade degenerative process in one part of the nervous tissues of the brain. Dr. Spotwood Taylor, a surgeon visiting from Johns Hopkins Hospital, assisted in the autopsy. The brain was sent to Johns Hopkins Hospital in an effort to discover what type of insanity was responsible for Lawson's actions. Eventually, their examination would turn up no abnormality either. Halsebeck, besides being the coroner, was the Lawson's family physician. He told news reporters, quote, "I've noticed during the past 12 months that Lawson was acting queerly. He had been coming to me with complaints of severe headaches." End quote. Whatever the source was for his headaches, an injured brain was not the cause. Only one son, Arthur, had been spared since he was visiting family only 2 miles away. The family was buried together on December 17th. An 18-foot grave in the Browder Family Cemetery off the Danbury-Germantown Road would be the last resting place of the Lawson family. The coroner issued a short report to the state that there could be no doubt, based on the evidence found on the premises, that Lawson was the culprit. The members were found shot or clubbed to death on the farm, located on a high bluff about 4 miles west of Walnut Cove on the Germantown Road. Lawson was found dead in a little clump of pines about a half-mile north of the farm. He used a single-gauge shotgun on himself. A note was found in Charles Lawson's coat pocket, penciled in his own handwriting, which said, "Blame no one but I." One of their 2 hound dogs, Sam or Queen, uninjured, was keeping watch over the body. There was evidence that Lawson had paced in circles for some time before killing himself. Inside the pocket was also a circular letter received by his wife from a maternity bureau and $58 in money. The discovery of the bodies was made by Elijah Lawson, Charles' brother. He opened the door and found 5 members lying dead in one room. When the coroner arrived an hour later, the bodies were still warm. It was found he had used 3 guns: a single barrel shotgun, a double barrel shotgun, and a 25-20 rifle. Mrs. Lawson was killed on the porch. It was believed she was holding the baby Mary Lou in her arms at the time a load of shot hit her in the chest. The baby and 2 boys, James and Raymond, were clubbed to death with the stock and barrel of the double-barreled shotgun. Marie, 17, was shot in the chest with a double-barreled shotgun, and she was probably the first one to be killed. Lawson took the bodies of 5 of his family and placed them in the front room with their hands crossed on their breast. The baby was wrapped in a blanket and laid in the cradle with crossed hands too. The girls, Carrie, 13, and Maybelle, 10, were fleeing towards the tobacco barn a quarter of a mile away, but were overtaken by their father, who shot them in the back. One was killed instantly and the other one was hit, but didn't die immediately. He finished the job by bludgeoning her. Both bodies were then dragged inside of the tobacco barn and laid out in the same manner as the other members. Charlie Lawson was described by his neighbors as a hard-working, prosperous farmer who was good to his wife and children. He started as a tobacco sharecropper, and by 1929 he owned his own land and had most of it paid up for. The community was sure he had never touched whiskey or any other intoxicant. A week before the tragedy, he took the family to take a photograph at a studio in Winston-Salem. Charles Lawson married Fanny Manring in 1911, and during their 19-year marriage they had produced 8 children. They were Arthur, age 19, Marie, age 17, Carrie, age 12, Maybelle, age 7, James, age 4, Raymond, age 2, and Mary Lou, age 4 months. The family had lost a third son, William, born in 1914, who died of pneumonia in 1920. The bodies were held at the Yelton Funeral Parlor at Madison. Present day, it is the Madison Dry Goods Country Store, and a museum has been set up dedicated to the family on the second floor. The funeral was attended by 1,500 persons. The services were conducted by the elders of the Primitive Baptist faith. Shortly after their death, Charlie's brother, Marion Lawson, opened up the farmhouse on Brook Cove Road as an attraction. A cake Marie had made the day of her death was on display, but eventually covered with a cake server, since raisins from it were taken as souvenirs. After 5 years, a family member took it and buried it. One of those who toured the house was gangster John Dillinger, who had just escaped from prison. The murder of the Lawson family was recorded by the Carolina Buddies for Columbia Records in 1930, and the Stanley Brothers produced their own version in 1956. Arthur Lawson, the survivor of the massacre, was killed in 1945 when he was 31 years old. He died when he drove his truck into an excavation in the Winston-Salem Walnut Cove Highway, where repairs were being made. He failed to see the barricade which blocked the passage across the break in the pavement, where the repairs were underway. The truck hurtled off the side of the highway, crushing him to death instantly. A passenger riding with him suffered head and internal injuries. He was buried in the Browder Cemetery. He left behind a wife, Nina, and 4 children, Nancy, Patsy, Maybelle, and James Arthur Lawson Jr. His wife remarried and moved to California. In 1990, the book White Christmas, Bloody Christmas was published. The author received information from a family member named Stella Lawson Bowles, who lived during those days when the family was rocked by the heartbreak of what happened the Christmas season of 1929. She told the author a story she had known for 60 years. Stella described how on December 27, 1929, the closest family members gathered after the funeral. Nina, married to George Lawson, and Ida, married to John Lawson, and some other ladies were in a discussion about the murder. This is when 13-year-old Stella joined them and was shocked by what she heard. Stella had lost her mother, Jetty, the year before, and her Aunt Nina had stepped into the mother role with her. When she had grown into adulthood, her aunt passed on the burden of the truth about what motivated the murders. Nina said that shortly before Christmas, Fanny Lawson had confided in her sister-in-laws with the secret that her daughter Marie was pregnant. Considering Jetty Lawson had died in May of 1928, indicates that Fanny suspected her daughter was involved in some type of sexual relationship for at least 18 months. However, it wasn't until just before their deaths that she found out Marie was pregnant by her father. Fanny was in a horrible dilemma. She was frightened of her husband, who had been acting irrational and violent, and his behavior was tearing the family apart. Marie wanted to leave and marry another man. Nina asked Stella to keep the secret, which would have added even more scandal to the family if it became known. Did the doctor conducting the autopsy on Marie fail to realize she was pregnant, which would have been difficult to do since she was about 4 months along, or did they decide to say nothing and omit it from their report? Did they think Marie had a sweetheart, or had Dr. Halsebeck, as a family doctor, suspect the truth, and decided to spare the family from further heartbreak? The author published another book in 2006 titled The Meaning of Our Tears. In it, she describes where Marie Lawson told a close friend, Ella Mae Johnson, just a few weeks before her death, that she was pregnant by her father. Fanny Lawson also knew. Many thought that fear of what he had done becoming known had caused Charlie Lawson to kill his family. Another friend, Sam Hill, said he knew the family was experiencing serious problems, but he failed to elaborate what they were. However, he did say that Charles Lawson had told Marie that if she told anyone there would be some killing done. The house was demolished many years ago. So, again, his brain was normal. It was examined, something that's unusual, but obviously, was there something that wasn't visible to in his brain yet, that's why he decided to do something after so many years of life? I don't know. That's a real conundrum. Okay, next story is out of Vintage News and it's titled Unveiling the Chilling Mystery of the Disturbing Circleville Letters that Haunted This Ohio Town. In the small town of Circleville, Ohio, an eerie series of events unfolded that captured the attention of both residents and curious onlookers from afar. It all began in 1976 when unmarked, mysterious letters started arriving in the mailboxes of townfolks. These letters, laden with personal information and accusations, sent waves of unease throughout the community. What made the Circleville letters phenomenon particularly intriguing was the accuracy of the details contained within these anonymous notes, suggesting the writer was someone deeply familiar with the townspeople's private lives. The Circleville letters began as an eerie phenomenon that quickly escalated, casting a long shadow over the small Ohio town. Residents found themselves ensnared in a web of suspicion and fear as anonymous letters filled with accusations and threats started appearing in their mailboxes. This unsettling series of events not only disrupted the peace but also sowed seeds of distrust among neighbors. The content of the letters was disturbingly personal, targeting individuals with secrets that many believed were known only to a few. This led to widespread paranoia, as people started looking over their shoulders, wary of both strangers and familiar faces alike. As the situation unfolded, the community's sense of security was profoundly shaken. The relentless pursuit of the letter writer, coupled with the mysterious circumstances surrounding the case, made it a topic of constant discussion and speculation. This not only put Circleville at the center of unwanted attention, but also strained relationships within the town. Friendships and family bonds were tested as accusations flew and suspicions grew. The impact of the Circleville letters rippled through the town for years, leaving a mark on the community's psyche. It was a stark reminder of how quickly tranquility can be shattered by the unknown, highlighting the fragility of trust in the face of fear and anxiety. The mystery of the Circleville letters, which began captivating the public in the late 1970s, is intertwined with several key figures and pivotal events that have kept armchair detectives and professional investigators alike puzzled for decades. Central to the narrative is Mary Gillespie, a school bus driver in the small town of Circleville, Ohio, who became one of the primary recipients of these menacing letters. The letters accused her of an extramarital affair, which she denied. Her husband, Ron Gillespie, also received letters, and the situation escalated until it tragically culminated in his untimely death in a car accident, a mishap some believe was orchestrated because of the letters. This event marked a chilling escalation in the case, transforming it from anonymous harassment into something far more sinister. Investigators, including local law enforcement and the FBI, delved into the case, facing a web of accusations and counter-accusations that made the truth elusive. Another significant figure in the case was Paul Freshour, Mary's brother-in-law, who became a suspect and was later convicted in connection with one of the threatening letters, despite controversies and debates over the evidence against him. The Circleville letter saga also saw dramatic events unfold, such as booby traps and public accusations, which only added layers to the complexity of the case. These series of events not only tormented the individuals directly involved, but also cast a long shadow over the community, highlighting the destructive power of anonymous accusations and the challenges investigators face in unraveling the truth behind such mysteries. Excuse me. The mystery of the Circleville letters captivated the public and law enforcement alike, sparking a decades-long quest to uncover the truth behind the menacing messages that plagued the small town of Circleville, Ohio. From the late 1970s through the 1990s, these anonymous letters filled with personal accusations and dark secrets targeted residents in a way that left the community on edge. The investigation into the letters presented significant challenges, primarily due to the anonymity and cunning tactics employed by the sender. Law enforcement agencies, including the FBI, were drawn into the fray, utilizing forensic handwriting analysis and attempting to trace the letters back to their source. However, the elusive nature of the evidence and the clever avoidance of detection by the sender made progress frustratingly slow. Amateur sleuths also threw their hats into the ring, drawn by the intrigue and mystery of the case. These amateur investigators sometimes complemented official reports, bringing new ideas and energy to the case, but they also muddied the waters with unfounded accusations and speculative leaps. Despite the collective efforts of both law enforcement and passionate civilians, the true identity of the person behind the Circleville letter remained a topic of fascination and debate. The case stands as a testament to the complexities of criminal investigations in the face of anonymity and the enduring human fascination with unsolved mysteries. The enduring mystery of the Circleville letters has captivated the imagination of many, leaving us with more questions than answers. These anonymous missives, which began to terrorize the residents of a small Ohio town in the late 1970s, have woven a complex web of suspicion, fear, and intrigue that seems almost too intricate to unravel. The letters, which initially targeted specific individuals with personal accusations, soon escalated into a widespread phenomenon that affected many lives. Despite extensive investigations and the conviction of one individual, Paul Freshour, for related crimes, the true authorship and motivations behind these menacing letters remain shrouded in mystery. The case stands as a testament to the profound impact that anonymous threats can have on a community, leaving scars that may never fully heal. As we reflect on this chilling saga, it's clear that the Circleville letters phenomenon is not just a local curiosity, but a stark reminder of the darker aspects of human nature and the mysteries that can lie hidden in any community. The letters ceased as mysterious as they began, leaving behind a legacy of fear, suspicion, and unresolved questions. This case challenges us to consider the depths to which individuals can go to manipulate and frighten others, and the enduring power of anonymity. In the end, the Circleville letters saga remains an enigmatic chapter in true crime history, a puzzle that, despite the passage of time, continues to intrigue and perplex those who dare to delve into its shadow. Interesting, they even had the FBI involved and they still couldn't get an answer as to who it was. Okay, next story is out of Stranger Than Fiction Stories, and this is titled Louise's Last Resting Place. In 1966, Louise Petrowitz disappeared without a trace. The mystery of her whereabouts appeared to be solved, with the discovery of a woman's remains found in a burlap sack on Long Island. Let's go back. It's October of 1966, and Louise was in a troubled marriage. And after 16 years, she had separated from her husband and moved to her parents' home in Sagaponack. She took her 11-year-old daughter Sandy with her, with plans to leave to Florida. And then the 38-year-old disappeared after withdrawing close to $2,000 from her bank account. When her purse was recovered a week later on the shoulder of Route 25, with a World War II bond and a Social Security card inside, it should have raised concern on the part of the authorities. Instead, they treated the case as a missing person and not a murder, and the local newspaper took no notice of it. Detectives interviewed her husband, who claimed he was humiliated by her betrayal and didn't care if she was alive or not. Alban Petrowitz divorced his missing wife in 1974 and remarried 2 years later. He died in 2000. Southold Police, Suffolk County Police, and New York State Police say they investigated the disappearance in 1960. Then the case went cold. For over 50 years, Petrowitz's family looked for her, unaware of a secret love affair she had with police officer William P. Bakken, a married man. Louise's family suspected she was murdered because she was pregnant with Bakken's child, and they knew she would never have left her daughter behind despite being in a troubled marriage. The decades passed, the Bakken property changed hands in the 1970s, but the owners had no clue of what would be found on March 19th, 2018. Inside the centuries-old farmhouse on Lower Road, sonar equipment scanned the cellar floor. Within a burlap sack, buried 7 feet deep, police unearthed bones believed to be those of Louis Petrowitz. William Bakken lived there with his wife Judith, who was the town assessor, and their 2 children when Louise went missing. It seems Louise didn't make it out of Southold at all, after all. However, it turns out that more than one person knew where the victim was buried. Shortly before the discovery of Louise Petrowitz's remains, Judith Terry, the former wife of the suspected killer, revealed she had told one person about the murder. But it wasn't just any person. It was the chief of police at the time the murder took place. The Suffolk Times found this information when a FOIA request provided the notes of the conversation between Boken's former wife and Detective Kenneth Richard during an interview on March 15, 2018. He asked if she had told anyone she had witnessed her, she had witnessed her then husband burying a body in the basement of their home. This was related concerning the exchange. Quote, Judith stated that at some point, she doesn't remember when, she told Joseph Sawicki Sr. what had happened. Detective Richard wrote about that interview, which he and retired Southwold Detective Joseph Conway Jr. conducted. She stated that she was very close with him and his wife and was godmother to one of their children, and because he was a police officer. Sawicki Sr. worked for the Southold Town Police Department for 29 years and died in 2013. He retired as a detective in 1980 and acted as a chief in the mid-1960s. Despite the discovery of Louise's body in 2018, the circumstances of her disappearance was whispered about among the small community for years, but it didn't go any further than that. Of course, no arrests were made. It wasn't until the case was revisited in 2018 with an in-depth interview of Judith Terry that the discovery of the secret grave was made. Looking back at the initial investigation, it appears that only the minimal effort was given into discovering the whereabouts of Louis Petrowitz, which lay only 7 feet below the surface of the basement. By using a diagram drawn by Judith Terry and her recollection as to the hole's depth, police would ultimately find Louise's remains. A statement given by former state investigator Thomas Colby in December 1969 mentions interviews with Chief Sawicki and others that failed to lead them to Louise. But Griffiths, a retired state investigator who had looked into the case at the request of Louise's family, said investigator Colby's partner, Dick Fairchild, had told him that Chief Sawicki was present one day, 14 months after the murder, when they dug in the basement and found nothing. Mr. Griffiths said no mention was made at the time of Miss Terry telling the chief that she witnessed the burial. He said investigator Fairchild told him that Chief Sawicki observed but did not help with the digging efforts. Fairchild said they had no cooperation from the town's PD, Mr. Griffiths said. End quote. William Paul Boken died August 20th, 1982, and was buried in Pottersfield, Hart Island, Bronx, New York. The last few years of his life, he was a cab driver, and since he had little contact with his family of origin, police didn't know they lived in New York. Police didn't know they lived in Long Island. By the time of his death, he had outlived both of his parents and all but one of his 4 siblings, who died in 1986. Balkin's extended family didn't learn about his death until 2013. Judy Terry learned of it in 2018, when she was 83 years old. It appears that once reassured that he was indeed dead, she felt more confident in speaking about what she had witnessed. She told detectives that she suspected Louise was interred in the basement because of the threatening comments Boken had made to her, with something along the lines that he would kill and bury her in the same spot. Detective Sergeant Sinning wrote of his interview with Judith Terry, quote, Miss Terry had a clear and detailed memory of the layout of the basement of the house on Lower Road. During that conversation, she went much further than in previous interviews and admitted witnessing her husband bringing a body into their basement. I was there when he brought her into the house, she told the detective. He laid her on the cement floor. I don't know if she was dead or alive. I would assume she was dead because she was wrapped in burlap or something. Detective Sergeant Sinning wrote, Judith stated that she never saw Louise again. 4 days later, Detective Sergeant Sinning reported receiving a call from Miss Terry's husband, George, who said his wife had since recalled even more details. Mr. Terry said his wife told him Mr. Balkan had demanded that she untie the binds around the burlap before he rolled Louise out of the burlap and into the hole. Miss Terry expanded on her account during the subsequent March 15th interview with Detective Richard and former Detective Conway Jr. She said she saw Mr. Balkan carrying the body wrapped in burlap out of the barn behind the house, and that after he began digging in the basement, he realized that he could be seen from outside through the basement windows. He then switched locations, Miss Terry said, and dug a new hole. Detective Sergeant Sinning gave Louise's daughter the clothing found with her mother's remains. It included a slip garter and blouse. 3 bullet holes marred the cloth. They corresponded with the 3.38 caliber bullets found in the body. The ME concluded Louise died from gunshot wounds to her torso. Review of police personnel files show that Bakken used sick days right before Louise's disappearance on March 6, 1966. He resigned from the department on October 7th. A year later, after Louise's disappearance, William Bakken was arrested on suspicion of abusing his wife Judy and was committed to a psychiatric hospital. These clues would have immediately put another man under the microscope, and the mystery remains as to why he wasn't. Was he not prosecuted for Louise's death because he was considered mentally ill? Strangely, the police blotter from 1966 is among several years missing from the town's archives. In January 2019, Louise's daughter Sandra filed a notice of claim against Southold Town and its police department, charging the officials knowingly concealed the circumstances of the death and thoroughly failed to investigate who was responsible. She believes that not only did they know who was guilty of her death, they knew where she was buried all along. Judith Terry, who was the only eyewitness to the crime, died in 2021, and her husband George a few months later. Interesting. It's very sad, though, to think that they didn't try as hard as they should, or they treat as a missing person. And of course, you know where that comes from? That it was like, hey, she was cheating on her husband or whatever. In other words, it didn't have the same urgency. How's that? So anyway, I will be back soon with more eerie news. Things of what they say that go bumping tonight. Until next time, take care.